How's it going, everyone? I think we'll go ahead and wait just a couple minutes for some people to filter in. I know these things always have kind of a couple minute lag, so thanks for your patience. We'll probably just go ahead and get started as it is 6:01 on my end. So welcome everyone to our Cal-TREX Yuba Prescribed Fire Training Exchange presentation on fire in the Sierra Nevada. I'm Jeff Lauder with Sierra Streams Institute and San Juan Ridge Taxpayers Association. We have a couple of really cool, exciting, we think really relevant talks for you guys tonight, one on cultural burning and one on causes and consequences of burn severity. But before we get to those, I want to introduce Steve Graydon, the instructor and one of the hosts of the Cal-TREX Yuba event, to talk us through a little bit of the background of the TREX event itself.
Hi all, thank you, Jeff. Hey everybody out there in digital land. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Want to cover a few things just to try and give you some information on what TREX is, and specifically what our Cal-TREX Yuba event is looking to do and what we have done. I'd like to just give you a big overview, and Jeff, you want to bump us ahead here? So essentially, TREX is a nationwide program developed by the Nature Conservancy in conjunction with the Forest Service and parts of the Department of the Interior. The main goal here is to be able to expand capacity to implement prescribed fire, but to do that in a way that is enhancing of both professional advancement as well as ecological improvement, and all the while, of course, using best practices to improve fire messaging and to articulate some of the lesser, maybe lesser publicized parts of fire that we want to try and bring to folks' attention. I know that there's an active burn cooperative here. Very, very glad to be part of some of that. We've integrated some of their work and also reached out to some parts of the community with the Yuba Bear Burn Cooperative. But really, every TREX is somewhat different. And so for ours here in Cal-TREX Yuba, we are working with the Fire Safe Council, some volunteers from local nonprofits. Our main host, big thanks goes out to the Yuba Watershed Institute and the work they've done to be able to organize and essentially support the work in bringing professionally trained firefighters out to cooperative burns. So just kind of hitting some of the bullet points here. I want to expound on some of this. TREX has expanded greatly since it was conceived in late 2008, 2010. We've seen massive expansion both in the West as well as across the U.S. We've got Spanish language TREX. We've got some very immense grassland TREXs. The Niobrara is one of the first, and one of the more popular TREX events that's been going on for a long time now. It takes place in the Klamath River area with the Yurok and the Karuk. They have a great program up there where they've been able to educate a lot of folks coming through, myself included, on some of the finer points on both the cultural as well as the ecological impacts that we can have for positive and for negative, of course, using fire. So just real quick, TREX is made to leverage resources. Everybody has skills and capacity, but oftentimes we can't always take advantage of that if folks are in kind of a siloed type of structure. So what TREX does is tries to crack those silos open and create some mixing of the grains there. And in this case, to really just leverage that diverse partner set like we have here in the Yuba Bear and in this area. We're really trying to leverage both all the the different aspects of both land management that folks play, and also to just integrate the professional training so that we can support cooperative burns on federal lands under the auspices of the National Wildfire Coordinating Group. One of the things, like I mentioned, that TREX seeks to do is to try and recognize cultural knowledge. I won't go too far into that because Dr. Don Hinkins is going to give us what is, probably one of the best understandings and or explanations of some of the nuances of cultural burning. And, really it is about, again, having an ecological impact. And at times our ecological information is bound in science, and culture really is a framework that has, historically worked, been in California for millennia, and something that we're learning to tap into more now where we're able to put fire on the ground. Another aspect, of course, is expanding local capacity. So we have, like I mentioned, we have the Nevada Fire Safe Councils involved. We've helped expand some of the crew there with the fire training qualifications, as well as local volunteers and the Sierra Streams Institute, the Yuba Watershed Institute, and others. We've received significant support from the North San Juan Ridge Fire Protection District. They're helping to train and also just to provide some equipment and support for our training. So really we're bringing this together to expand our local capacity and to be able to interact with professionals on the same level when it comes to fire. Again, back to the beneficial ecological outcomes, Dr. Andrew Latimer will be coming on later. I don't want to speak outside my range here, so I'll let some of those folks cover it. But the point being that, fire is fire. And it's when it's, really understanding that and paying attention to that as a deliberate thing, as well as a reflective, exercise after burns, after we do work. That really is about trying to measure our success by, attending to the factors that existed during a fire and understanding how that affects what comes after the fire. As you're all here tonight, you can see that this is about fire positive messaging. Fire positive messaging is simply to try and counterbalance a lot of the information and a lot of the visual and the visceral images we see all summer long. We live in a fire environment, and so it's important that we also reflect on the positive aspects of fire, where we can use this tool, this very unique tool that fire is, but we can use it in a way that elevates the positive side, where we can articulate both what are the intended goals, both ecologically as well as fuel reduction, and to try and give folks a better understanding of the whole picture of fire. It is always fire. It is just the circumstances and the conditions in which fire is put into the landscape that really decides, what we think about it oftentimes. And the end goal here, of course, is to return fire to the landscape. Fire is a massive influence on so many aspects of our ecology, our flora, our fauna, that we really bringing fire back to the landscape is a good first step in trying to, balance some of the buildup that we've seen over the last century due to fire suppression, but also to do it in a way that's cognizant of the history of fire in California and beyond, and to try and also educate and reach out to folks the whole while. But I will, pass it on back to Jeff, who can, give us a proper introduction for the two speakers we have tonight, who we are so fortunate to have them and very glad that they didn't have to take too long of a drive. So thank you so much. Please stay tuned. Please pay attention to YubaNet and other other news venues or your local nonprofit resource where we can get you caught up what happens after we get done with this TREX and see if we can't get some good fire on the ground. Thank you so much.
All right, so just a couple of housekeeping things before we kind of go into the presentations and the panel discussion. As I'm sure you've noticed when you came into the Zoom room, it did automatically mute you and keep you from turning on your screen. That is actually set for the duration of the talk, just to keep things kind of clean and kind of easy to hear the talk and see the talk. Because of that, the way we're going to be doing questions tonight is if you could hold on to your questions to yourself, basically, and actually write them in the chat. So you can write them in the chat at any time during the presentation. And then during the last portion of the kind of whole panel discussion here is when we'll come back to the questions. So we'll do Dawn's presentation and then Andrew's presentation, and then it kind of just a joint question session where we'll scroll through and read your questions from the chat. So any questions you have, place in the chat as we're going forward. We are recording this, so if you would like access to the recording after the talk to share it with others, we will have it available to view after the fact. So just contact one of us, and then we'll also be sending out notifications on how to view it after the fact. So the first talk this evening is actually going to be from Professor Don Hinkins of California State University, Chico. I'm sure you noticed as I shared the screen here, unfortunately, because of some internet issues, he actually pre-recorded his presentation. So we're going to be sharing a video, but then he will also be here for the panel discussion itself. So the video will be playing with his recorded voice. It should be coming through clearly. Please let me know if it is not. We'll see what we can adjust. So Professor Don Hinkins is a professor in the Department of Geography and Planning at California State University, Chico. He's an expert in pyrogeography, water resources, and conservation. He is a Plains Miwok traditional cultural practitioner. Combining his academic and cultural interests, he is particularly focused on applying Indigenous land management practices as a keystone process that aids in the conservation and management of resources. He's currently engaged in fire and water research involving Indigenous California and Aboriginal Australian communities, and he did just say hello in the chat, so he is here. And with that, the presentation is going to be an overview of cultural burning.
Good evening. It's my pleasure to present tonight on Indigenous fire for this Fire in the Sierra Nevada Cal-TREX Yuba event. My name is Don Hinkins, and I'm a professor in the Department of Geography and Planning at Chico State, and also field director for the CSU Chico Ecological Reserves. And a lot of the information I'll share tonight comes from my cultural understanding as a Miwok fire practitioner, but also in the context of the research that I've done working with Indigenous communities across the state, across North America, and also in Australia. To begin with, I'd like to give a little context to the framing of Indigenous burning. And within Indigenous cultures, particularly here in California, but elsewhere in the world where I work, there's often a story system that Indigenous people have around the use of fire and the knowledge of fire. And the first story that usually emerges is what I'll call the first fire story. And that first fire story is usually a story where it talks about fire that burns very extensively across the landscape, and the landscape becomes uninhabitable. And in that context, it's really important to think about the kind of world that we're living in today. And from those first fire stories, Indigenous peoples learn to use fire as a tool to manage the landscape, to steward the landscape, so that they wouldn't have to relive that first fire story again. And that's really, I think, the lesson that we need to be paying attention to, particularly in the context of the recent fires we've seen here in California. Indigenous knowledge systems are quite complex, particularly when we think about the extent of being able to live in the landscape. And one of my elders shared with me many years ago that if people stopped burning, wildfires would become rampant. And this wasn't her lesson. This was something that she had learned from her elders going back to the early 1900s. And when I think about the extent of some of the fires we've seen, to me, that knowledge system is really something that's at play in terms of the way that that our world is experiencing fire. But it takes us right back to that first fire story that I was just sharing about. When we think about the context of cultural burning, there's a lot of different reasons for why and how Indigenous people in California use fire. And traditionally speaking, there's a lot of different reasons for burning, but I've kind of broken them down into some basic ones here: maintenance of trails, game management, conservation of areas that are maybe fire sensitive, or what we would call assets at risk in the wildland-urban interface. We think about water stewardship. We think about just cleaning up the landscape. Cleaning up the forest floor, removing the biomass that's accumulated, and also the stewardship of plants like food plants, medicine plants, and fiber plants is all enhanced through the use of fire. Our landscapes evolved with a very specific type of fire. Indigenous use of fire was something that our landscapes were shaped with. And when we look at early photographs from Yosemite Valley, for instance, we notice that that landscape had been shaped by a very specific type of fire. That is the use of fire by the Miwok and Paiute people in Yosemite Valley. And the photograph on the left shows us that. It's an open meadow ecosystem. We've got some oaks scattered about, and we've got a few conifers that are scattered about on the fringes of that. Well, we remove Indigenous people from stewarding Yosemite Valley, and it's not just Yosemite Valley, it's everywhere in the state where we've removed it. We start to see a change in the system. We see a change in the system in terms of the densities of vegetation changing. We see a change in the way that fire behaves within those systems. So we've gone from being fire maintained to being fire vulnerable in a fairly short time period. The scale at which Indigenous burning takes place is pretty fine scale. If we think about the context of it, it can be anywhere from an individual plant that's being stewarded, maybe one redbud plant, or maybe it's one deergrass plant that's being stewarded for basket purposes, or it could be looking at a watershed and stewardship within that watershed to maintain certain ecological conditions. Maybe it's flow within a stream. The point is that Indigenous fire is taking place generally at a finer grain scale than what we see wildfires occurring at. And in this graphic that I put together, what we notice is that some of the wildfires that we're experiencing today are well beyond the reaches of what Indigenous fires would ever have reached. And when we look at the August complex in 2020 in the Coast Range, for instance, reaching over 1 million acres, that's quite sizable. It's reaching ecoregions, and it's affecting communities on the social scale. That it's not just isolated to one town or a neighborhood. It's really affecting a region. And so, Indigenous fires help to mitigate that if we think about the application of it to modern time frames to change the way that fire is moving through that landscape. And here I just highlight some of the conceptual differences between wildfire feedbacks and Indigenous fire feedbacks. And I think that the take-home message here that I think I really want for you all to understand is that Indigenous fire does things to reduce the types of emissions we're seeing and also enhance the sequestration of carbon. And when we see wildfires happening, particularly high severity wildfires, we're losing the ability to do carbon storage, and we're volatilizing all of the material that's there to put it back out into the atmosphere. And so Indigenous fire helps to buffer that and helps to enhance the ability to do sequestration, which I think is a really important thing that we need to be thinking about. Wildfires are part of the natural landscape, but when we think about it in the context of Indigenous fires versus wildfires past versus modern wildfires with fire suppression being a component of that, there's a real difference in terms of the way that it impacts the landscape, and in particular, the cultural drivers of the landscape. And so when I think about that, I think about specific impacts to sacred sites, for instance, with the use of bulldozers and hand crews and disregard for the sacred knowledge and the specific details of knowledge that protect sites as we would within our own cultural systems. And so there's a learning curve that's there that modern fire suppression needs to learn to embrace. There's also impacts that happen because of access to gathering sites, and a lot of tribal people struggle with access to sites to be able to go to, and a lot of times wildfires then close off areas even though there's certain resources that people may want to go in and harvest, like wild tobacco and morels and things like that. But then we also have to think about how wildfires and the severity of those fires and other impacts may lead to the decline of biodiversity or wildlife and other resources within those areas. But moreover, I think, and this is not just something that's specific to tribal people, but the idea of the changing landscape and what the changing landscape through high fire frequencies and high severity fires within the landscape can create environmental change, which can then trigger environmental grief, which we refer to as solastalgia. And for tribal people, this can be pretty devastating in the sense of not only is there a recognition of the environmental change, but this also is confounded with the historical traumas that many tribal communities and individuals have dealt with. So these are just some things that wildfires pose that cultural fire can offer a solution to. In terms of restoring and maintaining within the landscape, we know that environmental change is a constant, and indigenous people have lived through environmental change for many thousands of years. I mean, since time immemorial, fire has been part of California's landscape, and indigenous people have been using that fire as a tool. And it's just really the last, say, 200 years that fire has been absent. So process is really important. And in terms of being able to restore fire back into the landscape, it's about understanding the various parameters of the landscape, understanding the soils, understanding the vegetation and what that vegetation's needs are, understanding which species of wildlife are using those areas and what they indicate about how and when fire should be put back into a place, and also understanding the climate systems. And all of this is ingrained in indigenous knowledge systems for very specific places. In terms of restoring, it's about communities working together. In a lot of places, indigenous people haven't had the ability to continue the use of fire. But as we look forward, one of the opportunities that's there, and one of the traditional ways of doing it, is to have intergenerational learning. So young people, like young children learning from grandparents, etc., is one way of that learning taking place. And there's a lot of different contexts to the way that happens. In terms of the seasonal timing and frequency, if we think about the major ecosystems of California, they all, for the most part, have a fire component to them. And I've broken up some of the major ecosystems and think about, loose terms here for the vegetation communities of California in this graphic to kind of illustrate the frequency of fire and the seasons of which fires occur. And many of us are familiar with the research that Scott Stevens and others did back in 2007, which says that, roughly 4.5 to 12 million acres of California's landscape burned on an annual basis. And the reality is that, if we think about it in a cultural context, each of those vegetation communities has a very specific need from indigenous communities, and also just general maintenance for wildlife enhancement and those sorts of things that really create very high fire frequencies. And here, you see, like under Conifer forest, I say 5 to 15 years is a hypothetical range. But in some places, that fire frequency was every single year. You look at Yosemite Valley, and based on the anthropological records, there is an evidence of fire happening every single year, and it's being set by people. So people set fires very frequently at different times of the year, as we can see here on the graphic, to maintain different properties of those systems. And some ecosystems burn very frequently, and some of them less frequently. And I'll give some examples of that here in a moment. To give some context of where indigenous burning is taking place today in California, this map does a little bit to illustrate some of the places where it's happening, and it's increasing. In fact, there's more dots to add to this map, and even further south into even San Diego County, there are tribes working to bring back indigenous burning. And I fortunately have the opportunity to work with a lot of different communities throughout the state in the context of both being a cultural practitioner, but also in the research work that I do. It's taken me to these different communities, and I have very good relationships with tribal people, and I understand the issues in these places to help them to restore and revitalize fire within their landscapes. So some highlights here, looking at oak woodlands, these are high fire frequency areas. I've just given some examples here from the Cosumnes River Preserve and the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve in valley oak woodlands, blue oak woodlands, and black oak woodlands, all of which have high fire frequency in order to maintain it. And in the context of the work that I'm doing in these particular systems is trying to enhance and restore not only fire resistance and achieve conservation, particularly in the case of valley oak woodlands, which are very rare, trying to change the invasive species that are in these places to native species. And our native species require fairly frequent fires in order to maintain them. But that restoration of the native species also helps to enhance the wildlife use and also the cultural values of those places. And so high fire frequency is really important. And I think just to illustrate a high fire frequency, in the image on the right, what we see is a valley oak or a blue oak woodland that's had very frequent fire. This is actually the fourth fire in the last 10 years in this particular area. So some places require a lot of frequency of fire in order to maintain the ecological and cultural conditions. Similarly, our meadow ecosystems also require very frequent fire. Grassland systems burn very frequently. And if we're looking at stewarding for native species, that's something that to really think about. So on the image on the left-hand side, what we see is a first entry burn in 2011, and this is all done under cultural parameters for burning. We can see the emissions from this. It's about a 3-acre burn. And we've done now 3 burns in the same ecosystem, mostly in the cool, wet season to enhance the native species. But the main thing is that we're starting to see a shift in not only the native species dominance, but also restoration and recovery of the hydrology of this system based on the burning that's taking place too. And then also thinking about our mixed conifers, these areas, they can produce a lot of biomass on an annual basis, and so we need to be thinking about how to maintain that and manage it. And this is just an example from my own property where I use fire on an annual basis, particularly around the home site, to maintain protection around my home, but also enhance the vegetation within the area around my house. Chaparral and mixed conifer, or chaparral and montane chaparral, are areas that typically don't see very high fire frequency. And a lot of times when we think about the landscape, we've seen a lot of the chaparral expanding back out across the landscape because of the absence of fire. And so as we think about restoring fire back to the landscape, we can think about the timings of when to do that to achieve a finer grain mosaic to enhance the restoration and change the spatial dynamics of fire within that place. And we had the opportunity to do this last spring in February of 2020 on the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve in an area that had burned in 1999. And we were putting fire back into a place that had about 20 years of regeneration of manzanita and toyon and chamise, not chamise, but ceanothus. And reading the parameters of the landscape through a cultural lens, we were able to put fire back into a hill slope that that needed to burn, or at least to have the mosaic put back into it again. And we can see the image of what that fire looks like in about a 3-acre area. Riparian ecosystems are some of the most ecologically productive environments in our landscape, and they're often considered zones of exclusion because of that. Fire is an important process within riparian ecosystems, and indigenous people have applied fire to riparian ecosystems since time immemorial. And this plays an important role in terms of their conservation. Given the rarity of riparian ecosystems today within our state, many of these remnant patches of riparian ecosystems are vulnerable to fire simply because of the amount of fuels that they can accumulate, which, if those areas burn, we lose not only the carbon that's stored in those forests, but also the habitat that those forests are providing. There's also some things to consider around cultural considerations of smoke. And while air regulators might think about smoke strictly from a human health perspective and the negative consequences for the environment, on a cultural side of it, there's positive things to be thinking about for smoke. Smoke is used in ceremonies. We use smoke as a purification process. And so for humans, we use it for a lot of different reasons, for cleansing and for getting the airways to clear and so forth. Those are some of the health benefits. Spiritually, it's also used. But then in the landscape, smoke also has some benefits. And here I have a picture in the upper left of an inversion layer coming in that overnight will help to fumigate the oak forest. And that fumigation process is really important for maintaining minimization of mistletoe and weevils that infect the acorns. So that's a really important thing. And there's also research and traditional knowledge around how smoke inversions can also help to cool water temperatures for salmonids in particular in our streams. And spring run Chinook salmon are a species that will over summer in our streams in the Central Valley and in the coast ranges. And when the temperatures get high in the water, they can't survive. So when we have an inversion and the cooling effect of that inversion over the water, that helps those fish to be able to survive. So there's a lot of different policies and opportunities that are there. I think in terms of some of the main things is that, on an international scale, indigenous burning is something that is protected under the rights of indigenous peoples through the United Nations. As sovereign entities, tribes and tribal practitioners have the ability to self-determination under federal and state law. And under the Western Regional Air Partnership, there is a treatment of indigenous burning as a natural source of emissions. And I think that's really something that we really need to be looking more at in the state of California, is how we can use indigenous fire to help us to maintain and restore a healthier balance with smoke and emissions and wildfire impacts within the state. And to illustrate that, here's what I'm getting to, is that if we think about indigenous stewardship for carbon in different areas of the world, including and primarily in Australia as kind of leader for this, indigenous people are using fire to offset the greenhouse gas emissions and also ensure biodiversity conservation. And that same sort of thing could be applied in California. And under AB 32, we could be stewarding more and providing funding for tribes to create that. And it's not just about carbon, it's also about the ecological outcomes and the stewardship thereof. So in the lower picture there in the middle, and also on the right-hand side, we see some examples of where carbon offset burning is happening in Australia and the outcomes from it. And so we have these systems that are really rich and are maintained by indigenous people, and the fire and the funding through the carbon offsets pays for indigenous people to be engaged within their homelands to be able to store, to apply fire within those places. I'd like to return to the ideas of the first fire stories that I introduced at the beginning of this presentation. With the wildfires that we're seeing today, we have an opportunity that comes about. The devastation that we see at the landscape scale is on par with those first fire stories. Yet, if we understand what those first fire stories tell us, is that our landscape is fire prone, that we have to embrace fire within our landscape and uptake a culture of fire to steward for environmental resilience and the changing climate that we have, and also to ameliorate the effects of the change on our own health and well-being. And so all of these things working together provide us an opportunity to take and make change. And with that, we can think about how we can come back in and steward in areas that have recently burned, but also think about how we can take care of the places that haven't had fire in a really long time. With that, I'll bring it to a close, but I'll look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thanks and have a great day.
All right, thank you, Don. So like I said, we're gonna kind of hold off on questions. If you have them, you can feel free to put them into the chat. But we're gonna go ahead and actually transition here to Andrew. And so Andrew, I'm gonna actually unshare my screen so you can share yours while I pull up your intro here. So Andrew Latimer is a professor of plant sciences at University of California, Davis, where he studies responses of California plant communities to climate change and disturbance. His work currently focuses on Sierra Nevada forest tree responses to warming, drought, and fire, and on projecting future responses of grassland wildflower populations, kind of the gamut of drought and fire in Sierra Nevada forest. I actually first met Andrew, I think in New Orleans at the Ecological Society of America conference, where we had talked about some of the kind of overlap in our work in drought and fire and those kinds of things. And very excited to have him here to talk about some of his research into the causes and consequences of fire severity.
All right. Thanks so much, Jeff. A great introduction. And I was really excited to hear that talk by Don. Thanks so much. That's awesome. It gives a lot to think about. I am coming from a somewhat different perspective, a really different perspective, really, because I'm a newcomer. Yeah, so I grew up in the East Coast, moved out to UC Davis almost 13 years ago. And so I really, I've just been learning to become some kind of fire ecologist.
I think we might be having some issues. Andrew, I think you're muted.
You can hear me because I'm not muted, but
There we go. Now you're coming back.
Yep, we
okay.
got you.
All right, cool.
You might also want to try maybe turning off your camera. Just because yeah, I think it's a little bit, seems like it's a little bit slow.
Okay, all right. Oh shit, that was the wrong thing to do. Oh, that works. Okay. Okay, so is this working, Jeff? Can you see?
Yep, sorry about that.
it?
I think we're back on track here.
No problem. Thank you for keeping me on track. I was starting off by saying, yeah, I'm coming from kind of a different history myself of growing up on the East Coast and only moving out here 13 years ago. California ecology and fire. And so anyway, it's great to have the chance to address this group and share some things that I've been able.
Hey, Andrew, I sincerely apologize. Yeah, it seems like you are kind of cutting in and out still. I know this is kind of the bane of the Zoom presentation. It might be worth, it's up to you. It might be worth calling in and then just advancing your slides, if that works. I can send you the phone number link. Yeah, so sorry, Andrew. It seems like it's just kind of yeah, so Andrew, if you want to try calling in and then sharing your screen, and then you can still advance the slides we can hear you speak that way. And again, that's up to you if that works. It should be in the link that I emailed you. No need to apologize, Andrew. The same thing happened to me many times. It's kind of the nature of Zoom. And so, yeah, sorry, everyone. Would calling in work for you, Andrew?
I can try that.
Okay. And then in the meantime, sorry, go ahead.
To do that. I'm just not quite sure where the information is to do that. Let me check.
I will resend it to you right now.
Thank you.
So maybe in the meantime, folks, if you wanted to take a second and move through some questions or put some questions in the chat that we can get prepared for after Mr. Latimer's presentation. As you have these questions, go ahead and put them in the chat there, and we'll look to capture them and see if we can't field this and make the best of this technological lapse here.
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and read out the first one to Don while I'm sending this to Andrew. It was from Chris Friedel. He asks, Dr. Hinkins, can non-tribal folks practice, quote, cultural burning? What would that actually look like for non-tribal folks to practice cultural burning?
Yeah, so I guess if you want me to field that now, I can go ahead and do that.
Sure. Yeah, while we're getting
cultural burning, Sure. Yeah, the idea of cultural burning is kind of a weird term because this has actually come up recently with folks in different areas, different regions of the U.S. where the lapse of burning hasn't necessarily occurred. For instance, in the Southeast, there are non-native people who are using fire and doing it for their cultural reasons. And so the term cultural burning, I think, is kind of a poor one. I prefer typically to refer to as like traditional burning or indigenous burning to be more specific. But cultural burning can be done by anybody really. But in terms of like the specific kinds of fire and the applications of fire and the the ecological and the cultural outcomes for a specific place, for instance, in the foothills here in the Sierra Nevadas and the Cascades. It's probably linked to very specific species and the timings and the traditional knowledge of those places that we have to be paying attention to. So if you're living in a place for a long period of time and you have that kind of knowledge base behind you, then yeah, I would say you could definitely do it. And I think that's part of the idea with cultural or tribal folks who are trying to build the capacity around burning today, is that at some point, the hope is that the larger society can join in and be part of that process as well. So that's how I would kind of respond to that question. Thanks for that.
Next up, we have Jonathan Keene saying riparian burning. He'd like to hear a bit more about that. So just talk a little about some of the riparian burning issues and ways to approach that.
Sure. So yeah, in terms of the riparian burning, and the photos that I had there were actually from the Central Valley. So where I've done quite a bit of my research is in Valley of Woodlands in the Central Valley, and also willow and oak dominated woodlands elsewhere in the valley, cottonwood riparian forest as well. And a lot of times, and the reasons why I chose to do research in those areas and put cultural fire in those places, is that for years many indigenous peoples had tried to get agencies to burn in those ecosystems, and the thought was that, well, you can't put fire in those ecosystems because they're too sensitive. And if you think about riparian vegetation, they're adapted to disturbance, different processes. Flooding and fire is just another process. And from an indigenous perspective, people understood traditionally that those were maintained with fire. If you think about the distribution of villages across the state, they're mostly located along the riparian corridors, and so maintenance of travel corridors and gathering sites kind of fits into that. So I think, in terms of the opportunities that are there's a lot of opportunities there in terms of being able to steward those riparian areas with fire, and it all comes down to getting the seasonal timing right so that you're having the right outcomes. We try not to burn in the riparian areas in the summertime, for instance, because you might top kill the trees or you might cause a bunch of basal sprouting off of those trees. But during the fall, it's a really good time to be able to do that because the plants are dormant. So it looks like Andrew's ready to roll again. So I'm going to stop answering questions for now, and we'll get back to Andrew's presentation.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Awesome. Take 3. Can you hear me now, Jeff?
Yes, correct. We can.
All right. Sweet. Okay, thank you. Yeah, sorry about this, folks. How alarming. I hope it works and you can actually hear me. But let me know if the sound is too crummy for this to work as we go. Yeah, so I guess I'll just start from the beginning. I wanted to say a little bit of context, which is that I'm new to this system. And really, yeah, just moved out here 12, 13 years ago with a plant ecology and fire ecology background, and started learning about these ecosystems here. And it's been a pretty great experience to be sort of welcomed into the fire ecology research community here, and to some extent, practitioner community. And it's great to be here with you all, who I really admire what you're doing, and I think it's fantastic. It's exciting. I'd like to get involved myself. And a great talk by Don. I'm very excited to hear all those. It gave me a lot to think about. So I'll just roll here. Of course, I think where, as we all probably know, and Don emphasized, over the last couple hundred years, and more so over the last 100, the institutions and people in charge of land management in California have been much more they're not trying to put the squeeze on fire and kind of squeeze it out of ecosystems, and so it's not entirely crazy. There's some reasons why people do this. It's inconvenient to have fire destroying or burning up timber. It's smoky. Some people don't like smoke. It's dangerous in some cases. But, this has had consequences that Don's already kind of introduced and then described. And as a result, those prophetic words from a century or so ago that wildfire will become rampant have come true. And wildfire is increasingly escaping this kind of containment, despite billions of dollars spent each year to continue to suppress it, and despite a lot of effort, very sincere, hard, admirable effort to continue to contain it and protect neighborhoods from fires and so on. And this year, 2020, last year I guess it's now, was just kind of put an exclamation point on this trend that we've been seeing at least over the last decade, maybe a few decades. One of the things that I thought really became strikingly clear to me in a way that hadn't been before in 2020 is how closely fire links together lots of things, including something that often I think have kind of, in a lot of society, are kind of seen as remote, like management of forests or rangelands, other ecosystems, but they're actually very proximate, because when these forests burn, when an ecosystem burns, especially if it's burning out of control and during a time when the smoke is, putting out huge amounts of smoke, more than can be dissipated, say from a single watershed, it's going straight into the lungs of people working in the Central Valley, picking our food. And so like what we're eating is connected to our land management, even in areas that aren't growing the food, and to those people's lives. And of course, like housing policy and how we decide where to allow buildings to be built affects where people then choose to build them, and then makes kind of more vulnerable communities to fire, puts places out in potentially more dangerous areas. So those are just a few examples of those connections. And I think it's becoming clear to more and more people, and I think this is exciting, that fire is really here to stay. It's part of the ecosystems. You can try to suppress it, but that doesn't lead in a good place. And in fact, when fire, it's really difficult, impossible really, to understand why ecosystems in California, almost all of them, look the way they look without understanding the role of fire in there. And one of the things that's just been striking to me, coming in from the outside, is being introduced. Scott Stevens and Brandon Collins, some researchers at Berkeley, took me to some of their plots in Yosemite and Illilouette Basin. And I was really struck by how patchy and initially kind of messy it seemed to me. There's a lot of, there are open patches, piles of dead trees, then also dense stands nearby, riparian areas, patches of firs, patches of lodgepole pine, patches of Jeffrey pine, some things that look like the postcards of the way the Sierras used to look under frequent fire, and some things that didn't. But I think this is actually part of the, at least, learning process, is that, the landscape looks different from a continuous, highly controlled sort of landscape, where it's controlled in a different way by fire than it is by, say, forestry, or at least Western forestry. And the other kind of key point is that increasing different lines of research are showing that this kind of patchiness, non-homogeneity, messiness, if I want to call it that, is actually really important in a lot of ways, and produces resilience and stability in these systems, and to fire, most importantly, but also to other things potentially, like drought and variability in climate. And so this is a slide that my first grad student from UC Davis put together. He now works at USGS. Just to highlight some of the things that Don was pointing out in Yosemite Valley, here's another place in the Sierras contrasting what a historical, pre-1800, 1700 tree density might have looked like in some of those drier forest ecosystems in the Sierras, with a lot of space between a lot of the trees, versus a fairly similar area that would be filled in by lots of trees that are not being killed by frequent fires and therefore grow up and close the canopy. And so that takes that messiness or that non-homogeneity away and homogenizes it and produces this sort of continuous fuel structure that then really changes the way fire behaves. And so in the rest of this talk, I'll try to keep it really to time because I'm sure there's a lot of great questions already popping up. I want to talk just a little about factors affecting fire severity. And when I'm saying fire severity here, it's a pretty narrow definition. I'm really talking about dead trees. Why is that? Well, because whether trees are live or dead and the amount of live tree cover actually is a really powerful kind of fundamental organizer of the landscape and the ecosystem. And also because it's easy to see and then even to measure from satellites and things like that, or airplanes or drones. And yeah, so talking about severity, causes of it, and then some of the consequences of these, which will be largely reinforcing, I hope, what Don has said. And then at the end, look at some kind of directions of change that are happening now that I think are really positive and they're sort of like, there's not only a positive trajectory since I moved to the state, I would say, we're saying since 2010, but also even like second derivative is positive, like the acceleration is happening. And that's, evidence of that is that you guys are all here. So, okay, quickly, what causes higher fire severity? This is one way of explaining this that comes up a lot, and I use it in this fire ecology class that I teach. That, well, there's been a fair amount of debate this year about, I think it's sort of often reporter kind of questions like, well, is this climate change or not? Is it raking the forest or is it, carbon emissions that's making all these things happen? And of course, this is fundamental kind of fire ecology. Yeah, both, yes, both of those things are happening. The changes in the fuels and the changes in the weather. And it's all happening on this topographic template because fire is burning plants. It's moving across the landscape, responding to what the plants are there and to the history of how those plants have grown, the dead parts of the plants that have fallen off and are partially decaying, what kind of plants those are, what those fuel layers look like, how much, what kind, where. And it's also responding to weather, right? And critically, how dry the fuel is. That's the number one thing that the weather does, is it dries fuel out. Because the more water in it, the more energy it takes to heat it up. You have to drive off the water first, which takes a lot of energy before the fuel can be heated and then start emitting gases and then combust. And so the things that are changing with climate, to really probably oversimplify, but it's the kind of key factors are the dry. We always have a dry season in most of California, but it's getting longer, and the snowpack is getting shorter duration. Dries out sooner, fuels. So there's a longer window in which an ignition can turn into a big wildfire. And then second, there's some increasing numbers of really hot days relative to historic conditions, and also hot days coinciding with lots of winds. It's not actually that clear, I think, in the climate science what the trends are with wind speeds or things like feign winds coming out of the interior of the continent and driving big fires. It's not clear if that'll increase or decrease. But when you have those things happening with really high temperatures, which has happened, as happened in Australia last year and happened here both, then you can get sort of rapid fire spread and really intense fire behavior if there's enough fuel to burn. So to illustrate these things, just use a little anecdote about one small fire, even before our kind of recent real upsurge in severe fire. The Angora fire started near a neighborhood in Lake Tahoe, or near Lake Tahoe. And this is mostly pretty high density, typical fire suppressed Sierra forest. And so there's a lot of fuel there, fair amount of surface fuel, fairly continuous canopy fuels that the fire could also travel through. And it was windy. Unusually, this fire started pretty early in the fire season in June, so it wasn't as dry as it could have been. but the fire, the weather conditions were really extreme for June. And so what we can see here is the, aerial photo looking down at it a couple of years after the fire. You can see actually it's been salvage logged in places because there's no logs lying around. This used to be the central part, all trees. And it was a really high severity patch. Those trees were all killed by the fire. And the places where you don't see the trees being killed, sometimes it's basically, they didn't weather really, but fuel moisture, because there's kind of a stream running nearby. On the other side of the picture, there's low fuel loads. It's dry there, but there had been mechanical thinning followed by an underburn, so that the surface fuel loads are pretty low and the trees are fairly well spaced. You see actually many of those trees survived, and the fire was actually stopped before it went too far into this neighborhood. Only a few houses were burnt up. So that's one little anecdote about how fuel and weather interact. But we could sort of scale that up or put it into a chart form, the same thing we're just looking at, but put it into a graph. We included one project I was working on with Hugh Safford and with Jen Stevens, the student I mentioned, was we went around to 12 different wildfires, including the Angora fire, and looked at places that had been in those fires. So before the fire, where the forest had been treated, which in this case almost always meant mechanical thinning plus some form of underburning, sometimes pile burning, sometimes broadcast burning, prescribed fire. So both things, that's really important. Fire was actually involved in the treatment. And what we found is, if you look on this chart, it's kind of going weather or fuel moisture is left to right on it, and it's dry on the left side and wet on the right side. And the vertical axis is low severity at the top and high severity at the bottom. So as you go up toward the top, you're getting more trees surviving. And that sort of darker dashed line is representing the effect of fuel moisture on tree survival in untreated forest stands. So you can see that it's lower in untreated forest stands, tree survival is lower. It's also strongly affected by fuel moisture. If it gets dry, almost all the trees are going to be killed. Whereas in a place where the fuel has been reduced by previous fire and thinning, even in really dry conditions, it was somewhat, there was a lower amount of tree mortality. So that's kind of a general pattern across these fires. And we kind of have been able to go now using remote sensing and the kind of cloud computing that exists to go look at, let's look at all the 1,000 fires that occurred in, it's about 1,000, in this forest type, yellow pine mixed conifer forest in the Sierras, this green area under panel A, since 1984, which is when this Landsat data is satellite data is available from. And all of them that are bigger than about 10 acres or 4 hectares. And what's driving the severity patterns across all those fires, if we look at that generally. And the story really doesn't change that much. This slide just shows some of the ways of processing the data to get this fire severity metric, which is basically how much browner does the landscape get after the fire, or how much less green. And what did we find? We found, kind of it validates at least two sides of the fire, of the fire environment triangle. The fuel load is very important, as the greenness of one of these pixels and the satellite is looking at gets greener, you'd tend to have higher severity fire there. And as fuel moisture declines and it gets drier, you tend to also have higher severity fire. And then we also see in the lower right, this is a measure of vegetation heterogeneity, or maybe what I was earlier calling messiness or chaoticness or just patchiness. The more patchy in general, the less probability of high severity fire at that location. So yeah, both fuel and weather are really crucial. And even not just how much fuel, but how is it arranged? One other thing I just want to mention is that I don't know a whole lot about, because it's kind of about turbulence, and there's not that many events where this happens, that you get massive plumes rising from a wildfire that then drives strong winds rushing in, and then sometimes the plume collapses and you get winds rushing out. There's not that many to study, and I just don't. It's atmospheric physics and stuff. It's not something I really understand. But so less well understood, certainly by me. But I also think it's actually not so clear, it's not so easy to predict where this will occur. But some of the things that influence it include, you're more likely to get a massive bloom like this from the creek fire. This is the picture, it's from the creek fire this year, past year. If you've got a lot of fuel and it's very dry, so it's burning very fast over a large area, and you just have, it becomes more and more like an explosion. You know, you're combusting a large amount of fuel and releasing more and more energy in a short period of time. That's a really general way to put it. So that's not, I know it's not a great explanation. One question that is, I think, really interesting and concerning to some degree is the potential that large amounts of downed woody fuels, like we get after a major bark beetle outbreak during a drought, such as we had from 2012, well, it was mainly in 2015 and 2016 that so many of the trees were killed. Then you have a fire a few years later after a bunch of, all the needles have fallen off the trees and many of their smaller branches have started falling as well. You get this one sort of a one-time unusual pulse of surface fuels. And then later we'll even have more because there'll be chunks of trees, snags will fall over. And that could be producing some of the behavior that was seen in the creek fire last year. And so that's an issue where you kind of get these compounding disturbances happening. All right, I should probably wrap it up soon, but let me quickly go through something about some of the things that we know about the consequences of really high fire severity. Here's just a picture of one of the fires that we studied, just the Antelope Complex up in the Plumas National Forest. And those big red zones are areas where, you know, greater than 75% of the trees have been killed. So they're not treeless, and that's important. But there are large patches that are actually free of live trees. And so why does that matter? Because of the way the trees reproduce. They don't have a soil stored seed bank. Most of these species do not have a canopy stored seed bank, with a few exceptions, right? Sometimes lodgepole to some degree and knobcone to a large degree. But in this area, they're really not serotinous tree. There is no seed bank. So if you kill the trees off, the seeds that for tree regeneration have to come from the live trees. And when you get far from the edge of where the live trees are, the number of seedlings per plot drops way off. And that seems to happen within as little as 100 meters or so. I'm sorry, feet. It's pretty 200 feet. By the time you're 100 meters, it's very low. It's rare actually to find seedlings out in the middle of these big patches. And so that's not necessarily the end of the world. You've got a big patch with really strong shrub regeneration and lots of other things growing, but you won't have trees there for potentially a long time. So there's the question, do you want to plant them in or not? And sometimes a consequence of really intense fires is that you get also, you know, the traits of the shrubs. Many of the shrubs make them really respond well to fire because the seeds germinate really strongly after fire, and or because they resprout. And then that's like makes Chaparral really resilient. Fantastic feature. It also can potentially change a discontinuous fuel layer into a continuous fuel layer. And this is probably part of what helped the campfire spread so fast when it started in 2018, was that 10 years before that, another fire had come through and burned with high severity up the slope where the fire started. And there's enough, you know, as you'd expect, good, strong shrub response. So you had a fairly continuous layer of fairly flammable fuels under very dry conditions. So the campfire was able to kind of rip through there really fast. It also ripped through some plantations that had been started. And maybe it would have moved quickly anyway because there was a strong wind. But there's probably some kind of feedback happening here with you know, fires. They sort of read the vegetation as they're moving through, and then they write a new vegetation layer that affects the next fire. You can think of it that way. I'm going to pass on this, except just to say that how much tree cover is left after the fire really changes the microclimate under the trees, and that changes what herbaceous plants you get growing underneath it, as well as the shrubs. And so to kind of wrap this section up, or this most of the talk up here is, this is actually strikingly similar to the more detailed and kind of better laid out figure that Don had near the end of his talk of fire that starts off in an ecosystem that's fairly low in fuel load and has been experiencing frequent fire, such as might be the case under indigenous fire management. will tend to burn at a low intensity, not kill that many of the trees, but kill off many of the young ones that are trying to come in and make the forest more dense. And so as a result, you end up back again with a low density forest. Whereas if you start with a really high fuel load and it burns under the wrong conditions, dry, windy, hot, then you tend to get high severity fire, which then can also sometimes at least fuel kind of high severity reburns as well. So you get these kind of two loops going potentially. And that's something that's really, I should have emphasized at the beginning, because Don's talk is much more comprehensive about lots of different vegetation types. I'm really mainly talking about this kind of mid-elevation zone in the Sierras where you can actually get these very different fuel structures depending on the fire history. Whereas in Chaparral, it tends to be fairly consistent fuel structure. Well, we could talk about that, but more consistent, where you pretty much got this continuous canopy. And Southern California Chaparral, it'll burn hot, and then it will produce more continuous shrubs and so on. Whereas these forests that we're talking about can be really different in structure, in the same location, same environment, depending on the fire. Okay, so just to wrap up, here's some ideas about where are we going? Well, if there's fire happening that we don't like, what should we do? And I think the most important thing is more use of fire, as you're learning about and training to participate in here. And then also I'd say, judicious, I guess, careful use of wildfires when they occur. Don't necessarily put them out. This is something that's really changed over the last 10 years, is that some of the national forests have embraced this idea of kind of zoning areas where it's safe to allow wildfires to burn under conditions where they're behaving too extremely, or they're threatening to escape into areas where there are a lot of houses or something. As well as things where, like, mechanical fuels reduction in conjunction with prescribed fire can be really powerful as well, especially where you really need to be able to control the fire if you have to, like right around the edge of the town. You might be able to do that just with prescribed fire, but mechanical fuels reduction might help you get there faster. And then, of course, slow down climate change, slow down warming would be helpful, and ideally changing houses to be less flammable would also be good. And so, I don't know, I threw this one together. I think, we're in a choose your own adventure scenario because we're well into the story now of fire in California in a lot of different ways, and even into the modern, Western dominated kind of story of fire. But we're not at the end, and how that ending turns out is kind of up to us. And working with fire is really the way to go. And some other things, like we could use our resources as well as we can to put trees back in the landscape in some areas where high severity fire has taken them out, and we really want them back for a lot of different reasons. And then when we're doing that, putting trees back in some places, we'd want to do it in a way that's not as fragile as a high density pine, one species pine plantation, but instead would hopefully be more patchy and more diverse, I think, be another goal. All right, so that's it. Thank you so much. Thanks for your patience with my technical issues.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Yeah, so much to talk about in kind of different directions, but that I think all kind of meet in the middle, obviously. So yeah, I think just with that, we'll kind of transition directly into questions for either speaker. And so I'll kind of go through the chat to look at where we left off last time. And yeah, by all means, keep adding any questions you have to the chat as we go through for either Don or Andrew about either of their presentations. So the last question where we kind of left off before was for Don, and it says, is there opportunities for non-Indigenous folks to observe tribal or native burning applications in the area?
Yeah, there's a lot of work that's going on right now in different areas in that map that I showed, where some of the different Indigenous communities are working on fire. There's definitely opportunities for folks to come out and participate and see those happening. I guess, one in particular that comes to mind is like Ron Good down in the Mariposa area does kind of more public type burns. That's a good opportunity to kind of connect in with some of the tribal burns. The Yurok and Karuk burns that Steve Graydon mentioned with their TREX burns are ones that the public can come out to, although this year there hasn't really been those opportunities. And then also, when and how we get some burns going on ecological reserves, that's another place where folks can come out, depending on who we're burning with on what days, we can have that open too. So, I guess try to think about who's burning in your area and make connections with them and find out if there's opportunities for you to join in on that.
Awesome. And so next question is from Eric Jorgensen. And I might ask for a bit of clarification. I'm not sure if you're referring to kind of its effects on the landscape or the intent, but the question is, how is cultural burning different from neighborhood burns or like prescribed burn association burns?
Great question.
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, we've got a prescribed burn association burn taking place about 6 miles down the road from my house tomorrow. And as I walk around the woods, I'm looking at things on my landscape as my cultural indicators for burning. And those include looking at the moistures, it's looking at the different vegetation types. I'm thinking about the birds that are present and singing on territories right now. And I, on a cultural framework, would not be burning in the same ecosystem type on that site. So, I guess the question comes down to what are your objectives of the burn? And, indigenous burning is very different from prescribed burning or, other types of agency type burning, simply based on that, but there's also the cultural understanding of the law and the indicators and the rights to burn in place. I mean, it's a pretty complex thing. I could talk for hours about it. But there's a very different approach to it. And sometimes a neighborhood burn might include those things, and sometimes a prescribed burn might include those things. In fact, one of the burns that I highlighted in my talk was a burn on the Ecological Reserve, where it was actually a burn that we did with Cal-Fire and partners like Terrago and others. But the timing was set specifically based on my reading that landscape and saying, look, we've got this opportunity with these indicators being present, let's burn. And we achieved great outcomes from it that had it just been, set by the agency saying, oh, let's go and burn today. They might've set that at a totally different time of year, and our positive ecological and cultural outcomes would have been totally thrown out.
Awesome. I don't mean to interject into people's questions because there's a lot to go through, but I actually wanted to jump on that question as like an addendum to it or addition to it. I'm curious, there's been a lot of discussions on pros and cons of fall burns versus spring burns. And I'm curious what some of the different ecological outcomes from a cultural perspective. Are there some of those with spring burns? Is it mostly fall burns? How do you look at those cultural and ecological outcomes from different seasons of burning?
Yeah, that's kind of what I tried to address in that kind of calendar view of the different ecosystems. Each ecosystem maybe has a range of the seasons when it's appropriate to burn within it. So, living in a mixed conifer forest, for instance, what I've noticed is that there's good opportunities in the fall and through much of the winter and then the early part of spring. But as you get too late in the spring, you tend to have a lot more impacts on the oaks. You have a lot more impacts on the canopy in general, just because of the moisture uptake of the plants and the heat underneath it allows for too much transpiration. You can actually top kill trees because of that. So those are the things you really have to pay attention to. And I generally look for the opportunities to burn when it's going to have the least ecological impacts, but get me the greatest outcomes from that burn.
Awesome. So Jamie Irvin asks, was cultural burning widely done in Southern California, specifically in Chaparral? I hear fire scientists say that much of SoCal has been receiving too much fire in recent decades, and that prescribed fire is maybe not appropriate there. But I've also heard a different perspective from Indigenous fire advocates.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I just did a podcast for my fire class on this the other day, where I was talking about this. But there was definitely a historic use of fire by tribes in Southern California. And I think, yes, those ecosystems have received a lot of large fires and a lot of unseasonal fires that have created some challenging situations for being able to do restoration of fire in those places. But when I look at those landscapes and I think about, for instance, the Santa Monica Mountains and the invasive grasses that have come in there, some of those invasive grasses are the same species that, based on my burning in oak woodlands and meadow ecosystems, by timing your burns right, you can work to eradicate those non-native species and start to recreate the fine-grained mosaic that exists under Indigenous stewardship. People often refute this idea that there was a fine-grained mosaic in Southern California Chaparral, but if you think about surviving in a landscape and in a cultural context, the plants that grow there, many of them are culturally significant species. So in the Southern California ecosystem, I think about like lemonade berries and wild tobacco and just different plants that are there, chia. They all benefit from having the right kind of fire, and they all maybe are coming in at a different serial state present, in the first year or 10 years after a fire, or 15, 20 years after a fire. And if you need those resources to survive, then you need to make sure that your burning is maintaining that within the system, and recognizing that your fire sensitive species, or the fire, what do you want to call them? The obligate seeders, the species that lays down seed and requires a seed bank, like some of the manzanita, that you're giving enough time for them to be able to regenerate, because there's a cultural use for them too. So it's complex, but you have to understand it, and you have to think about, like, how do you live in a landscape if you just let it all be burnt as a big fire?
Yeah, no, that's a really cool way of, I think, combining, the ecological view stemming from the cultural view and vice versa. So there's another question to Don. It says, is there any work being done burning along the San Joaquin Valley floor? When I broached this subject, the air regulators in the valley were apprehensive that a burn approval would be given. Proposed burning will be in a riparian system along the Kings River east of Fresno. So any burning in the valley?
Yes, in fact, one of the pictures that I had from the riparian burn was actually in the San Joaquin Air District on the McCollum River, and did my dissertation research within that air district, part of it anyways, and they were actually pretty easy to work with. It depends on the size of the burn, and you obviously want to be able to work with your air regulators around that. But we're actually planning, as of last week, I got approval, green light for planning out a 20-acre burn back on that same site in fall. So I'm looking forward to working with the air district there for being able to do that. And in terms of the Kings River, I think that's fantastic. I'm really excited to hear that folks are trying to get fire back down there. I know that the Wapchumni tribe, some of the tribal members down there have been trying to work on things like that on the Kuya Oaks Reserve, and it's definitely doable. And just work with the air district and get them on board early.
So we have a kind of a comment, but I guess we can kind of rephrase it as a question. Jonathan Keene pointed out your chart on housing numbers in the WUI, the Wildland Urban Interface, in different states. And the comment is about kind of the different population sizes. So I don't know if you have any comment on that, population size in California that is in the WUI, kind of relative to actual population. Like, do we see the same values and percentages that we do in the raw numbers of houses in the WUI as a potential driver of increased ignitions and things like that?
Yeah, great question. No, I thank you for, you called me on it. That was a lazy slide. I was basically looking for something to stick in there about housing density in the WUI, and that's not the right one, because, it's going to be driven primarily by population size. That said, the trend is, over time, has been to a lot of expansion of that zone as housing prices have increased and the population's increased.
Yeah, no, and I think John Keeley, I think, had some research on this too, about just showing the sheer density of increasing home building in the Mui, and that being related to increasing emissions. Definitely an interesting trend. So Steve Graydon asks, and you kind of point this out in your talk, does high fire severity that creates a lot of downed and dead trees after some breakdown, does that create sort of a feedback loop in addition with fine fuels and immediate regrowth? In other words, can high severity beget high severity in timber areas? And I think you pointed that out in one of your slides. And so I would just kind of tack on to Steve's question, and I know this is kind of a conjecture thing. I think you showed that that is the case. Is there a way to kind of break that cycle?
Yeah, fantastic question. And I actually think it's a complicated answer. This is the one that's not so clear. Because if you look at kind of, the way a standard fire behavior models will treat those large diameter fuels, is they're not important because they don't burn quickly, so they don't drive the rapidity of fire spread or ordinarily kind of flame height, those things associated with rapid fire spread and high intensity. Rather, if there's like a down tree and it's really dry, it'll sort of tend to smolder for a long time and have a big impact on the soil right under it. Or if it's lying up against the tree, it'll like kill that tree, but not a sort of bigger scale impact on fire severity or fire behavior. But I think there's also some evidence that simplified kind of fire behavior model is not capturing the whole story. And that at least some of the time, if you have a lot of area burning at the same time, as is happening in the creek fire, just a large area where you still have a fair amount of downed trees burning, that sort of aggregate amount of heat going up can actually help drive one of these plumes, the kind of large plume that then sucks in wind and makes the fire more intense. But I think this is actually it's probably somewhat context dependent, because typically, you're going after a fire where there were some beetle killed trees that fell over before the fire. They don't disappear. They don't actually combust the logs. So, you would think, well, they're not actually going to influence the fire severity very much. But there may be exceptions to that, such as if there's a lot of it burning at the same time and it's producing enough heat to kind of drive the plume upwards. That's my take on that anyway.
Yeah, and then just the kind of cycle that you outlined, where after high severity fire, you have maybe some more flashy fuels coming in that can then refuel that high severity fire. I mean, do you have any thoughts on what kinds of management activities also would help break that part of that cycle?
Yeah, well, so if there's an area where, I do want to emphasize, like, it's not inherently bad to have an area, even a large patch necessarily, of montane chaparral dominated by shrubs. That's great habitat for a lot of animals and provides all kinds of other services, puts a lot of nitrogen in the soil, stabilizes the soil. But, it's not forest, and if it's not fixing as much carbon per year, it's not ultimately storing as much, at least above ground. So if you wanted, for aesthetic reasons, or because you wanted to recreate forest habitat, or if maybe you've got too much montane chaparral now, or you want to grow timber, whatever, you might want to put trees in there. So that's, so often, so in early post-fire environments, a lot of the times there's really kind of competition between trees and shrubs. And if you have a lot of trees, rapidly growing trees in an area like that, or patches of them, they can grow quickly enough to shade out the shrubs, which are much more light demanding. They can't, if you take a shrub out from a sunny patch and put it under a fir tree, it will start to shrink and die off usually. So anyway, so the way to suppress the shrubs or create kind of patchy shrubs would be to have pools of dense shade created by trees. And then there are also like more direct kind of controlled ways of going in and, people do sometimes go in and masticate up the shrubs or rip them out with a chain, or so if you really need to create a fire break quickly, that's what you would do, I guess. But over the longer term, yeah, creating a sort of a diverse, patchy area where you've got some trees that are, patches of trees that are pretty shady. You don't have shrubs under those. You've got sunny patches where the shrubs are persisting. It's kind of an ideal, I think, and the way a lot of the landscape used to be under more frequent fire.
Yeah, and that's actually a perfect segue to the question from Ann Hobbs, which is kind of question, kind of comment. It just says it sounds like it's very important that continuity management or maintenance, either after a prescribed burn or wildfire, is critical for planning purposes. So an example here in Nevada County is looking at the 49er fire, which was, I believe, 1988. You can, barely see some of the oak trees that burn, now completely hidden by new growth. So the comment, I guess, is to kind of talk a little bit about management of that continuity and its significance in planning for fire.
Yeah, right. So, right, continuity either sometimes, through one kind of, I'd say, frontier of at least, the research that, I guess, scientific fire ecology research is bringing fire back in sooner. This may be something that I expect it is something that Don knows a lot more about than I do. But yeah, actually bringing fire in more frequently may be a way to do that. To kind of, there's some really interesting work that's been done at Blodgett Experimental Forest that UC Berkeley runs. And they've done a whole bunch of kind of testing different treatments and measuring the responses, those kinds of responses. And I think that you were talking about where you get some really rapid growth of dense vegetation that's sort of surrounding the trees that are also coming back. Then they've tried sort of different methods for dealing with that. Well, what happens if you burn it again? What happens if you go and thin the shrubs out? Anyway, so yeah, it's not like once you've burned something once, you can walk away. Yeah, there's a kind of continuing tending or maintenance that probably needs to be done. And I just wanted to actually jump right to the next question, if that's okay, because
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
this is really related, which is sometimes you see areas right around houses, like if you go to, I don't know, the west side of Lake Tahoe, and there's some really well maintained fuel breaks, but they're also kind of sterile, like there's no shrubs under there. The trees are evenly spaced. And I don't think that's necessary. I mean, I think the evidence is that it's not necessary. You could have patches of shrubs where it tends to get sort of, I think, increase the fire risk is if you've got continuous shrub canopy and the weather gets really dry so that live fuel becomes dry enough to burn intensely. But if you've got patches of shrubs, totally fine. Yeah, so I think actually there's room. You might not want to have shrubs growing right under your house or right under some tree that you really wanted to protect, like in the oak savanna, oak woodland environment. If you want to make sure that the oak survives the fire well, or isn't top killed by the fire, then you might want to kind of control the shrubs right under that oak. The ones nearby in an open patch won't be a threat to it.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting example of, I think we see a lot in Nevada County, kind of mixed treatments where a lot of people are doing a lot of mastication or, kind of, blanket even space treatments. And I think this, speaks back to your heterogeneity comment again, and heterogeneity research. And I think almost to the idea of thinking about how fire moves through the landscape. Of, you can almost think about where even to place those clumps, so that if a fire were to burn through the landscape, does that clump matter? Kind of like what you're saying here. Is it going to burn hot at a spot that could be dangerous, or is it going to burn hot at a spot where that mixed severity is a good thing? And so I'm actually curious, Don, that's a good question to kind of send over to you too. I'm curious what you think about that same question. Like, what is your view of these kind of park-like landscapes also?
Yeah, could you rephrase that again?
So the original question that was posed to Andrew, that he was just commenting on, is from a local habitat perspective, I feel sad seeing park-like woodlands mostly devoid of a shrub layer following fire safe treatments. I'm wondering if you see it this way, or if you can help me reshape my thinking. Is there a habitat problem with this kind of even treatment, blanket treatment, and is there a way to mitigate risk and have more shrubs in the wildland urban interface?
Yeah, no, I think about that quite a bit. You know, if you burn too frequently, at least this is my observation, you know, kind of more as a practitioner, in areas, and you probably noticed in the one photo I had for the mixed conifer at my house there, you know, it's an area that horses had been kept in before, and I maintain it pretty much on an annual basis. Sometimes I give it a 2-3 year rest before I put fire back into it, but I don't have shrubs in that particular spot. And I think about that, you know, and as I watch it, I notice, well, okay, I get some manzanitas that'll start to seed into it. And then do I want those to establish, or do I want to maintain it as an open area? You know, if I let those areas rest, then the seeds for like ceanothus and manzanita and some of the other shrub plants will come in, and sometimes they'll persist in places where there's a change in like a micro topography shift or a little moisture pocket or whatever at the time when I'm burning. And so, you know, the timing of burning is important, and then also, you know, the way that fire patterns on a landscape. And, you know, for me, I'm just letting the fire mostly just creep and do its own thing. I'm not forcing it into places to create a contiguous blackened area. And you know, so you get these little, what I call fire shadows, where the fire hasn't gone to, and that's where those shrubs will start to emerge. And so you know, if you're paying attention to that and you're thinking about how you're burning, then you can achieve getting those things back in, and then maintaining them as that shrub layer. And in certain areas that I've noticed around here, you know, we've got really great cover starting to form because of that mix of thinning and the open patches that are maintained for more frequent fires. And species like quail and so forth are coming into those areas because of that, where, you know, years ago there were no quail here. I mean, you could hear them every once in a while, but they weren't present as they are today. And I think that's a really good indicator of good quality management, is when you start to see some of those species start to come back into a place.
I want to be really conscious of you guys' time. So Andrew and Don, I don't want to, take too much of your time. It is 7:30. There's 2 questions left, so I'm not going to try to put you on the spot. If you would like to stay and answer, one of them is a quick one, actually, just says, Don, how can we access the fire podcast that you mentioned? Then there's a longer question after that I will leave up to you on if you would like to answer. It is I think, very interesting question, but yeah.
Yeah, so the podcasts are not publicly available at this point, although I have a lot of requests for them. They're my mode of teaching, because I live in a remote area, as many of you probably do as well, with satellite and poor internet connection. In this time of COVID, teaching has been via podcast. So every week I push 4 podcasts for my students, and that's a lot of work, but they're not publicly available yet.
Awesome. So yeah, again, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but would you be willing to take just a couple more minutes for one more question?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk fire all day long. Some of you on here know this. We've talked it out in the field and everywhere else about it. So yeah.
I think it's actually a great question to end with both of you, and it was originally proposed to Don. It says, from a traditional Indigenous perspective, how do you see the dual reality of human planned fires and wildfires? Ideally, how does the seasonality feel of setting small fires throughout the cooler seasons, but also experiencing natural occurring wildfires in the summer? How did that kind of seasonality impact Indigenous land use and movement in the past? And how could we see that reality unfold as we move toward more balanced fire regimes? That's a brilliant question.
Yeah, well, no, it definitely is. And, the truth of the matter is obviously that, wildfire and human ignitions go hand in hand. But I guess the one thing that often is in the back of my mind is how frequent is the wildfire ignition happening? While we might end up with a with the the monsoon picking up over the Great Basin, over in the summer months, and putting some lightning on the high country and the Sierras, for instance, how frequently does an event like what we experienced here in 2020 and in 2008 and in 1999 happen? It's roughly every 10-year period that I see where lightning ignitions happen. So I think humans were and are the main driver of fire. Even in today's context, most of the ignitions are coming from people still, just in a different context. So they definitely go hand in hand, and there are definitely time periods, and most of those wildland fire starts from lightning are not burning under the conditions like the North Complex burned or something like that. There's a place for it, right? And there needs to be that balance within the landscape, and the idea of I think Martin and Saptis, once in their research paper back in 1992 said biodiversity begets biodiversity, and they were talking about indigenous burning as the main thing, but that biodiversity also comes from burning at different times of the year and at different spatial scales and temporal scales, and it all creates the good that this landscape evolved with, right?
Yeah, Andrew didn't want to put you on the spot. I don't know if you had any comments on that last question either about just transitioning fire regimes into the future, and yeah.
No, it's a great question and great answer. The only other thing that kind of occurs to me is that I think ideally it would be great to be able to relax some of the really tight control on wildfires, whether they start, regardless of kind of how they start. Because though, when we're really putting out almost all the fires rapidly, the only ones that tend to escape are the ones that are burning in really intense extreme conditions, or sometimes really remote conditions or high fuels. And then the ones that we can't put out are ones that are burning super intensely and simply can't be fought safely. So that is skewing kind of what our ongoing, even though it's maybe more invisible than it's less visible and intentional seeming than starting a fire ourselves, doing our own burning or kind of managing an existing wildfire in some kind of safe zone. The actual practice of fire suppression is actually having a huge effect on what fires are doing. And I think this question about, the seasonality and allowing, 2008, there was a similar, huge number of lightning ignited fires, similar to last year, except it was in June, somewhat wetter conditions, not as high winds. And, a lot of those fires, there were too many to put out, so they actually did get around a fair amount and burn something like 1 million acres, I think, total. But they could have probably done more because it was, at least in some places, probably an appropriate place and a time for them to burn. So anyway, in general, thinking about are there ways to relax the grip on the wildfire part of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, I want to thank you guys both so much, Don and Andrew. I think this has been a really awesome, powerful combination of kind of two perspectives on fire in California, and I think a lot to think about out of these two talks. So with that, I think I want to thank everyone for coming. And Steve, I don't know if you had any wrap-up comments, but thank you guys so much, Don and Andrew. This has been super cool.
Yes, no, a final thank you so much to our guests. These are, we are privileged to hear everything you had to say and to take up your time on a Friday night. And what I would say to folks is to remember these ideas when we have the inconveniences that we do, when we have smoke, when we have, when we have the concept and the fears of fire, that we really need to look holistically, and we can't have a NIMBY approach to this, right? We really have to embrace kind of that big picture, and we want fire in our backyard. So let's figure out how to do it, and to do it safely and with the right outcomes. Thank you all. Jeff, I'll hand it to you if you want to seal the deal, and maybe we can look at sharing the link to this afterwards.
Yeah, I think people are just signing off, but yeah, I'll definitely, for those who are still here, we're absolutely going to be sharing a link to this video afterwards for anyone that you think wants to see this. So you can check in with us, or we'll be blasting out the information as well via email and Yuba.net and some other sources for a link to this talk.